Grand Admiral Thrawn has become a character with a somewhat complicated legacy over the last 3 decades, since he was introduced in the Thrawn trilogy, before making his way into multiple references and appearances in other books of Legends, and then being one of the first Legends characters to be introduced to the new canon, not just in new books by Timothy Zahn, but even in the animated shows like Rebels and live action like Ahsoka. But with his prominence has come a lot of fan debates, particularly when it comes to the character's ethics and what he was actually willing to do. A recent example of this sprung up about whether Thrawn would have left the Empire over the destruction of Alderaan, and leaving aside the fact that in Legends he did in fact stay loyal after this point, while there's some points made that he may or may not have agreed with it as a practical, effective strategy for beating the rebellion, which I think is at least a fair conversation to have, when it's framed over whether Thrawn would have left the Empire because of the destruction of Alderaan itself from a moral standpoint, then I think it's pretty clear Thrawn didn't have any moral qualms about that kind of action in situations where he thought it was warranted or at least effective. Later portrayals of Thrawn in Legends novels, particularly Outbound Flight and then in the new canon's Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy, do somewhat soften Thrawn's character into a character who's deciding to put up with a lesser evil to accomplish a greater good. But at all points, it's pretty unequivocal that he is willing to go to pretty extreme lengths to accomplish his goals. And that goal gets primarily framed as the protection of the Chiss Ascendancy once he's explored as an actual character more, so it's something which doesn't come up in the Thrawn trilogy originally, but he was trying to protect his homeland isn't really the blank check for mayhem people often seem to portray it as. This also tends to fit into a more frequent conversation where the portrayal of Thrawn in Star Wars Rebels is accused of not understanding the character because of examples like forcing the worker in the factory, Morad Sumar, to test a speeder bike he had sabotaged, essentially a clear death sentence since Thrawn knew it was going to malfunction and explode, despite the fact that these workers had been pressed into service, they didn't sign up to be there. The claim, though, is that he would never do something so clearly cartoonishly evil as he does in Rebels, and he wouldn't throw away lives of people working under him like that. But if we look at Thrawn's introduction in Heir to the Empire, Timothy Zahn has Thrawn do something that is just as egregious. When Thrawn and his flagship Chimera are trying to capture Luke Skywalker, Luke performs an evasive maneuver which allows him to briefly break out of the tractor beam lock, and then he drops a proton torpedo. So when the tractor beam lock is reestablished, he tricks them into thinking they have him caught when really they're pulling in a proton torpedo. This allows Luke to escape, and Thrawn later questions the tractor beam operator, asking him why he failed to reestablish the lock. The operator, Chris Peterson, says he didn't realize what he'd locked onto until the torpedo detonated, and that his training never covered it, so it wasn't his fault. Thrawn doesn't like this excuse, but rather than an in-depth review of the training that these Imperial conscripts are given, because it's noted repeatedly up to this point in the book that many crew members, including this one, are in fact conscripts, he instead orders his bodyguard Rook to execute Peterson. This wasn't sabotage by Peterson, it was one guy who similarly did not actually sign up to be there, being executed for not being good enough at his job in the moment. What Peterson did sign up for was more lore videos by liking this one and subscribing for more, though sadly he won't be able to watch them because of what Rook and Thrawn did. So Thrawn may not be throwing people away left and right like Vader, but it's particularly ironic that this comment says Thrawn would never do this because, quote, killing your own men ensures that that person will never be able to learn from their mistakes and improve. Because the whole narrative of the scene is Thrawn explaining to everyone around him who's kind of watching in horror as Thrawn executes this guy, the difference between an error and a mistake, saying an error only becomes a mistake once you refuse to correct it, and that him ordering Peterson's execution was correcting the error. The Thrawn trilogy is really pretty clear on this overall. Thrawn, whatever motivations he may be given later, is definitely still a villain. The very first scene we see sheds more light on his potential response to wiping out a planet or a population. Thrawn believes that studying a person or even a species' art can give you insight on how to defeat them, and he calls Captain Gilad Pellaeon of the Chimera into his meditation chamber, which is filled with holographic artwork. Later on in Chapter 15, Pellaeon is back in the chamber, and he notices there's one real piece of artwork, a sculpture which Thrawn says represents his one failure to gain insight into a species through its art, saying that while he had grown to understand them over time, it wouldn't prove useful in the future as he ended up destroying the species' world, effectively telling us he committed a genocide, but also clarifying how he would feel about the destruction of a planet if it was necessary to further his aims. Both of these two acts, the execution of Peterson and the genocide, give pause even to staunch Imperial Gilad Pellaeon, who seem to have a distasteful memory of Vader's similar methods for dealing with underlings. So when you have situations like Thrawn suggesting an orbital bombardment of Lothal even, this is very much not out of line with what he's done before himself, especially in his introduction in the Thrawn trilogy. So while maybe he would see the destruction of Alderaan as too much of a rallying point for potential dissidents, it's hard to suggest he would have had a moral opposition to what Tarkin did, or that he thought brutality itself was something to avoid because it might increase sympathy for your enemies. A large part of his strategy when taking down the New Republic is tricking planets into thinking he had access to some secret kinds of technology that allowed him to devastate their worlds if he so chose. He would park cloaked ships underneath planetary shields and then make it look like he was able to execute planetary bombardments through them. So again, planetary bombardments are not that far out of the range of what Thrawn would normally do. Even in some of the later books by Zahn, Thrawn being willing to go to such extremes isn't exactly rare or unheard of. I've spoken in some other videos about some of Zahn's later stories, going back and whitewashing some of his characters a bit, and it does happen with Thrawn as well, influencing some of the perception that Thrawn in Rebels isn't like the quote-unquote real Thrawn, despite being fairly close to the Thrawn trilogy version, because he's a bit less openly into the cruelty in the newer Thrawn trilogies. But even then, adding in the motivations for why he's acting how he does, it doesn't change the fundamental problems with how he's acting. In Choices of One, for example, a book from 2011, so after some of that other background information on Thrawn had been added in Outbound Flight, we see Thrawn talking to Palpatine just before Endor about the plans Palpatine is putting together to use Endor as a trap and lure in the rebels. When discussing defensive measures for the shield bunker, rather than the multiple garrisons of troops Palpatine plans to use, Thrawn suggests something quite a bit more drastic, burning away all of the forests within a 100-kilometer radius of the shield bunker, or 62 miles for all of the Americans. And here's what that would look like around the city I live in. A 100-kilometer radius is a big area. That is a lot of crispy teddy bears. And this is done for the specific purpose of eliminating the threat of the local primitives, something Palpatine downplays in his own planning for the trap he's laying. So it's definitely not a situation where Thrawn is upset about the implications for the Ewoks. They are why he wants to burn down their homes, and probably them with it. In the same vein, we have to keep in mind the reason Thrawn ultimately lost his campaign in the original Thrawn trilogy. He didn't suffer a strategic defeat at Bilbringi, though it's possible the New Republic's plan would have worked. He lost because he was killed by his own bodyguard Rook. Rook was a member of the Noghri species, who, with the help of Leia, had been slowly discovering that their planet Honoghr had not actually been saved by the Empire like they thought. During the Clone Wars, a ship, later retconned as a Lucrehulk, carrying a bioweapon named Trihexylophene 1138 crashed on the surface, effectively poisoning it. Vader turned up after the Clone Wars, and when the Noghri killed his accompanying stormtroopers, Vader decided he wanted to make use of them as personal assassins and agents, so he promised to clean their planet. They swore their allegiance to him, and in reality, while they did slowly clear some land for the Noghri to use, they were actually spreading more poison to ensure the Noghri remained bound in their service. Thrawn inherited control of the Noghri after Vader's death, and continued to poison their world while demanding their service. The fact that he was willing to keep perpetrating this clear atrocity is a core part of the story. When he is talking to the Noghri, he treats them like the servants he sees them as. He has no sympathy for their situation, he just sees them as owing their lives to the Empire. Even though he knew the Empire was responsible for their situation, the Noghri didn't owe the Empire anything. And the fact that he was willing to keep perpetrating this atrocity isn't some side point unimportant to his character. This is the way the story sets him up to lose. This is supposed to be his big flaw, that he didn't understand that this was going to happen. That's going to do it for today, though. I'd like to do a deeper dive on the evolution of the characterization of Thrawn, covering some similar points in a lot more depth someday. But ultimately, my takeaway is that, well, certainly there are newer stories with Thrawn which portray him a bit more sympathetically. The idea that the version of Thrawn we see in Rebels is actually just antithetical to Thrawn as a character beforehand isn't really that true. It's just most similar to the Thrawn that we get in his original appearance in the Thrawn trilogy, where he is the main antagonist and we're seeing him not through the eyes of someone Thrawn considered an equal, but through the eyes of his enemies and his underlings. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed this quicker version for now. I've still been getting the new puppy settled, so that's why we've been back to the 1 video per week schedule recently. Hopefully we'll be back to the 2 or 3 per week before too long. Thanks for watching, remember to like and subscribe for more, and I hope to see you next time.